Hi, good evening from Korea and Japan, and good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Chung Min Lee, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I am very glad to be moderating a very important, webinar today with three and perhaps one more panelist who is on his way. This is something that I think it is dear to all of us because the subject is, can Korea become a global player? Last week, I wrote a report. It was uploaded on the Carnegie website. And the key question here was after the May 2021 summit between President Moon and President Biden, in my opinion, this was arguably one of the most successful U.S. Korean summits over the last several years. If you read the readout in the joint statement, it's something that, for example, the leader of France or Germany or even Japan would have done with his U.S. counterpart 10 years ago. And so I think many people were pleasantly surprised that this was really the case for South Korea. I'd like to thank the Korea Foundation for their support for this particular program and ongoing work on the Korean Initiative. And let me also thank my colleagues at Carnegie, in particular Alex Taylor, a senior program manager, and Katie Bodo at the Asia program. And without their support, this wouldn't have been possible. Today, I am really glad that I'm talking to you. As you can see from my background, I'm in a hotel room in Jeju Island. And so the wonders of technology enables me to talk with all of you all across the world. Let me just briefly explain, and as I said, I'll basically tell you who we are joined by. Brad Glosserman, an old friend of mine going back many, many years. He is not only one of the most prolific watchers of Japan and Korea, but of Northeast Asia as a whole. He is the author most recently of Peak Japan, The End of Grand Ambitions, from Georgetown University Press in 2019. Earlier, he co-authored a book with Scott Snyder on the Japan ROK identity crisis from Columbia University Press. He is deputy director and visiting professor at the Tama University Center for the Rulemaking Strategies and senior advisor at Pacific Forum. He probably knows more about Japanese foreign policy than most Japanese foreign policy makers. Now, Jean Lee is chair of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy at the Wilson Center. She is one of the most astute watchers of North Korea and Korean affairs that I am personally engaged with. She became really famous several years ago when she opened the Pyongyang bureau of the Associated Press. And then subsequently, she also headed the office in Seoul. She became the first American reporter, as I understand, was granted extensive access in North Korea, and that was back in January 2012. And so she has been really active on a number of issues. I watched Jean recently, on one of these, either public radio or public TV, when you were talking about the future of North Korea. And so we are always learning from your insights. And I really hope that you will be able to go back to Pyongyang to see what's happening on the ground as soon as possible. Now, Gina Kim, she is a chief analyst for North Korean military affairs at KAIDA, Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, South Korea's premier defense think tank. She is an author on North Korea's nuclear program in English and in Korean. She's watched North Korean affairs, but also she has written extensively on Chinese and American security policy in the region. And so Gina is also someone I've known for a long time. She's also an adjunct professor at Yonsei University teaching international security. So let me welcome all of you again. And for those of you who are tuning in from outside, I'm sorry about the technical snafu we had last week, but we are back online. And let me just first of all throw a question to all of you, and then you can let me know what you think, and then we'll take it from there. So my first question to all of you is, if President Moon's foreign policy, especially after the May summit, really becomes more global, is that sustainable? So I want your quick reactions on that topic. So Brad, can I ask you for your opinion, please, from Tokyo?
It's certainly possible. I just think it's very unlikely. My guess is that, as always, the attention of decision makers, foreign policy, security, otherwise, will be directed more closely to home. And while the country's got the interest and the capacity and capability to affect a global foreign policy, I'm afraid that probably is going to be just overwhelmed by the exigencies of the moment.
All right. Jean, what's your view?
Well, as you know, President Moon is in the last months of his presidency. So I think a lot of it will hinge on whether this is a foreign policy path that can be carried out by either a successor from his party or whoever successes him from another party. And that will be a challenge because the politics have been so polarized in South Korea. And I hope to hear from those of you in South Korea about that a bit more. But I think it'll be interesting to see whether this path that we saw being laid out at the summit between President Biden and President Moon is one that can withstand this change in administration in Seoul. And that's just on the Seoul politics front. There's certainly so many other issues, as Brad mentioned, the relationship with Japan, which we've seen has been very difficult in the last couple of days, and then the rise of China and how that strategic competition plays out. And we didn't mention North Korea, but I'm hoping Gina will address that.
Okay, Gina, what's your quick take?
Well, I would hope that the South Korean government publicly informs that the summit was the result of efforts made by the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because the South Korean government recognized that no specific details came out at the U.S. Japan summit. So South Korea took the lead for a month in negotiating a joint statement and fact sheet and presenting a draft to the U.S. Because these efforts were preceded, then we have a very successful summit, which presented so many details about the future cooperation. The real achievement of this agreement is that it has laid the groundwork for follow-up actions, because it contains the fact sheet, and the joint statement contains specific implementation plans, such as the establishment of working group, consultative body, and many others. And that can be used as a basis for carrying out related projects by concerned agencies and ministries in Seoul. And because there is such a basis, the budget can be received from the National Assembly, and creating new programs and staffing can become possible. So I think in the coming months and years, we can see some continuity of cooperation in global issues.
Okay. You know, one of the things that really struck me in the summit was that for the first time, I think, although businessmen always go to summit meetings from time to time, the top 4 chaebols in South Korea were present at the meeting. And when President Biden had the press conference in the White House, he particularly asked the chiefs or the representatives of Samsung, SK, Hyundai, and LG to stand up. And I think that really shows that for the first time in some ways, there are things that South Korea can do that can really help the U.S. in an era of intensifying U.S.-China, I guess, rivalry. But before we get into more specifics, I wanted to really go back to Jean's question, which is, as you know, in March 2022, there will be critical presidential elections in South Korea. Currently, the field is wide open. The ruling Democratic Party has a huge advantage in the National Assembly, but so far that has not resulted in a higher traction for their candidates. Both sides are grappling for public attention. Nobody knows who will become the nominee for each of the conservatives and the liberals. But going into 2022, my hunch is that foreign policy issues, as important as they are, will not be at the center of Korean electoral politics. So, Jean, let me ask you, if you are able to forecast what's going to happen next year, regardless of who becomes president, will it make a huge difference if the Democratic Party wins the Korean presidency versus the conservatives and the foreign policy agenda that he or she may pursue?
So if we're speaking solely on foreign policy, I think what was promising from the summit in Washington, the Biden-Moon summit, what was promising was that the vision that they laid out for a kind of joint collaborative foreign policy is one that I think has potential to be sustainable beyond a Democratic-led administration. So Democratic Party-led administration in South Korea. And by that, I mean that it is one that is more rooted. It was more focused on some of the common policies that the political parties, the opposition and the ruling party have. And that I think is important. And so that I do think that a lot of effort was made to make sure that that summit focused on something that might be sustainable, even though the two parties have been so polarized and on such opposite ends. And by that, I mean, when we look at, despite the polarization, when we look at the things that the parties have in common, one of them is the global pandemic. So we saw a lot of effort focused on the role that South Korea can play in this global pandemic recovery, and also the economy, the role that South Korea and South Korean companies, especially the ones that you mentioned, can play in filling a gap in the supply chain. And those are objectives that South Korea has, that is a national objective and an international objective, and not one that's just rooted in this or that party. And then also,
you're more hopeful for bipartisan foreign policy?
So I'm not saying that I'm hopeful. I think that it's so polarized, but I do think that they did a good job in identifying particular areas of collaboration that could potentially transcend the political divide. So I would say I think hopeful might be a strong word because I think it's so polarized, but maybe hopeful, maybe optimistic that they will be able to find some areas that will move beyond the political process and help the next administration, regardless of what party is in power in Seoul, continue on this path with the United States, with the Biden administration, so that there isn't such a disruption in their joint vision for foreign policy.
Okay, Brad, what's your take?
My take would be that, of course, that it is potentially sustainable. Certainly, I mean, there's two ways to look at it. I think the first is the degree to which the agreements between, that was reached between Moon and President Biden are capable of, the bilateral piece is sustainable, and I think that is. So the question really becomes domestically within South Korea. And to be honest on this, I would have to be deferring to Gina and to Jean as to how that works. But I would think that by and large, it is the high notes. And if we want to do a deeper dive, this technology competition piece and this tech piece is really vital to where we're going to go. There should be a continuity in South Korean policy on these issues, because conservative or progressive, I would think that you're going to have a commitment to supply chain stability. You're going to have a commitment to more resilience domestically. You're going to have a commitment to all of the kind of cooperation on this front that should be and is certainly capable of being perpetuated by either government or whatever government in Seoul. The question just becomes the political will and the degree to which there becomes point scoring or any other distraction in Seoul, quite frankly.
Okay, quickly, Gina, from your perspective, especially on defense issues, do you think that whoever becomes the next president, he or she will be able to pursue a global agenda?
Well, in my opinion, middle power diplomacy is something that both parties would endorse, and contributing to the global security cooperation will, I think, continue. And policy toward North Korea, which is one of the most important defense issues for South Korea. Well, aides from the Moon Jae-in government give advice in the Lee Jae-myung camp, and looking at the team members, it is expected that they will prefer the North Korean policy that is most similar to that of the Moon Jae-in administration. This would be a more independent and more conciliatory policy for North Korea. And in the case of candidate Lee North Korea policy seems to be similar to that of the Biden administration, in my opinion, because he emphasized more than once a step-by-step implementation on the premise of complete denuclearization. Because he emphasized principle-based policies, it seems unlikely that there will be a serious difficulties in policy coordination with the Biden administration. By the way, the conservative government, in principle, does not deny the importance of improving inter-Korean relations. The cause of tension on the Korean Peninsula in the past was mostly driven by the factors originating from North Korea. So any government's foreign policy and security policy are have the same direction unless there is a major provocation made by North Korea, in my opinion.
I could ask you, I think one of the things that I see that's happening over the last several years is that consonant with China's rise, North Korea as a major security issue, even with nuclear weapons, as serious as it is getting less traction. And I think in some ways, this is going to be a pivotal transition in Korean foreign policy. I agree that our bandwidth is consumed with North Korea and Northeast Asia. But over time, because technology is becoming such a critical issue, and the fourth industrial revolution is a critical, wave, does that mean that North Korea's space in the context of Korean foreign policy is going to get smaller, regardless of who becomes the next president?
I'm not sure you were muted. Sorry, is that question directed to me?
Yeah.
Or was that to Gina?
So the question, it was basically directed to you, Jean.
Okay. So I think at the moment, North Korea surprisingly has been less of an issue than it has in the past because North Korea has been somewhat quiet. I think that if we do start to see some provocations from North Korea, when North Korea decides that they need to draw some attention, then the attention will turn back to North Korea. And so I think that in a sense, we've seen more of a focus on both domestic South Korean issues and then broader Indo-Pacific issues because North Korea has been somewhat quiet. I think it's misleading. I think that North Korea always has to be paid attention to. Just because it's been quiet on the provocation front doesn't mean that they're not testing and refining and expanding their arsenal. It does make me nervous when things are quiet, because I do think that when they reemerge, it's going to be with something that may surprise us and may raise the stakes in the discussion around North Korea. And they will find the right time to reassert themselves into these debates about foreign policy. So I think I think that's the fact that North Korea has been self-imposed isolation and had somewhat quiet on the testing front that we're seeing means that it hasn't been as much a part of the policy. I'm not sure if I've answered your question.
But Brad, well, thank you, Jean. But Brad, if I'm on the same page with you in this respect, I understand that North Korea consumes a lot of oxygen of Korean foreign policy, and rightly so. But over the longer term, as Korea becomes much more globalized in many respects, do you think that Korea will be forced to pay much more attention to climate change, energy transitions, other critical issues affecting the global commons, on top of the need for a much more resilient and pro-US in many respects supply chain? Does that mean that Korea will basically veer towards a more globalized picture?
Well, you're right insofar as those issues are going to demand attention. And you can already see that playing out at this moment when you look at in the Biden diplomacy, in every meeting, whether it's the Quad meeting, the Moon meeting, the meeting with President Moon, the meeting with Prime Minister Suga, the meetings with Europe, there's these three baskets of issues. There is climate change, there's vaccine diplomacy, and there's high tech. And then overhanging it all is trying to get everyone in line on China. So there is just no way to escape that. And so you're going to have, I would anticipate, 4 years of at least that kind of foreign policy template. And South Korea is going to have to address those issues not only because Washington pushes them, but because those are the issues that actually do matter. So, the fact is that there are driving national security concerns, both domestically within the fact is that those issues that South Korea has to address on its own, and then similarly, I think with the United States and with its other diplomatic partners as well. And I think Europe is something I've been thinking a little bit about, but the Europeans are focusing on the exact same sets of issues. So through all of that, South Korea is going to have to deal with it. The problem, though, is that it's got a disgruntled neighbor on it very close by. And so whenever it wants, North Korea will interrupt those happy, kind of cogitations and demand attention as well. So, the reality is North Korea always has the potential to play spoiler. And frankly, I think we should all probably be getting a little bit nervous with just how quiet and cooperative Pyongyang has been over the last couple of weeks.
Okay. This question is for Gina, and it's from Eun-Jung Cho of the Voice of America, and she's asking, will the flare-up in tensions between Seoul and Tokyo over a Japanese diplomat's, comments recently hamper Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman's efforts to promote trilateral cooperation this week? So, Gina, just quickly, do you think that whatever happened in the last several days over the Japanese minister's remarks and the fact that President Moon decided not to go to Tokyo to attend the opening ceremony of the Tokyo Olympic Games, is this positive or negative for future trilateral cooperation?
Well, in my opinion, Japan and South Korea will continue to work on issues to improve relations. President Moon also said that it is so regretful that he could not visit Tokyo because they could not reach an agreement that would be good for summit. And then he also mentioned that South Korea will continue to work on all those thorny issues, and perhaps when this visit to Asia will create another opportunity to fix the problems, in my opinion.
Brad, people talk about trilateral security cooperation between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. You and I have participated in Track 2 meetings for the last 20 years plus. It does go on, but it's become weakened in many respects because of the perennial tensions between Korea and Japan. Under President Biden and Prime Minister Suga and whoever becomes the next leader of Japan, depending on the outcome of the election, what is your, forecast for the future of U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral security cooperation?
Couple of qualifiers. First, if I can just directly go to the question that Ms. Cho asked, which is, I would say the easy answer to her question is no. It's not going to hamper Secretary Sherman's efforts, because I don't think they were going to have a lot of payoff anyway. So I think that everybody would have gotten together, but I don't think there was going to be substantive movement. So
you're basically frozen now for a couple of seconds. So until you get back online, Jean, can you carry on where Brad?
I think Brad is back.
Brad is back.
I'll try to be brief. So number one, I don't think it has an impact because there wasn't much going to happen. Number two, I would just qualify that I'm not sure how much longer Prime Minister Suga is going to be Prime Minister. So, So there's that, given the events that are unfolding. I would think that at this point, nothing is going to happen until the election in South Korea at a minimum, just because the trust in President Moon is so low here. But on the other hand, there is an understanding that there needs to be trilateral cooperation. And it's just that they've got to figure out a way to put a floor on this relationship and start the very, very slow process of rebuilding trust. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think there is a recognition on all three sides that it's important. There is a determination on the part of the U.S. to bang some heads together and recognition that we've got to play a role. The question just is whether or not we're really going to find that there is sufficient ground, to start getting some traction out of it. It's just every time we seem to make a little bit of progress, we slip back again. And quite frankly, my sense is just the mistrust between the two governments is so high at this point that it's just going to be really hard to do anything substantive.
One of the points that I wanted to stress with all three of you, is this. If you are a Chinese policymaker in Beijing or sitting in Pyongyang, looking at, for example, strengthened U.S. ROK technology cooperation, for example, and the fact that the Koreans are, it seems anyways, there is a growing consensus on forming a stronger technology alliance with America and on climate change and on other critical issues, will this signal to the Chinese that South Korea is now more tilting towards the U.S., Gene, than before?
Yeah, that's a good point. And one thing I was going to say is, if we take a step back and look at the outcomes of that Biden-Moon summit, one of the things that I found so interesting was that it was not. So I was less interested in what this signaled for the rest of the Moon presidency than in what it signals in terms of the priorities for the Biden administration's foreign policy, right? This is one of the opportunities for them to unveil their foreign policy. And of course, we saw that they put alliances front and center and indicated and underlined that restoring alliances would be core to their foreign diplomacy. And what I found so interesting was South Korea's role in this policy as a country that has benefited and has so much to offer when it allies with the United States. And so it was a chance for South Korea to show off as well, to show how far they've come and that they're not just a junior partner, but can also has the potential to step into a role as a global leader. But what was interesting to me was the potential for that scenario to signal to other countries, smaller developing nations in the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, to signal to them that here's another country that was a developing country and is now the 10th or 11th world's largest economy. If you follow in their footsteps and ally with the United States, look what you too can accomplish. And so I thought that I did get the sense that there was that signaling to the rest of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, and to position South Korea as a country that can play that kind of an inspirational role or a role model. I think South Korea has a way to go before they step fully into that role. But I saw it as a very interesting strategy on how to signal and convey the Indo-Pacific strategy on the part of the Biden administration to get more nations in the Indo-Pacific on board with the United States. And that, of course, the subtext is side with us and not with China. So the subtext is this is about the rise of China and the rise of this strategic competition between the United States and China, but not in such an overt way. So I think that we did see. I wanted to mention one more thing, which is we had the Chinese ambassador to South Korea publish an editorial in the 중앙일보 that has been very controversial in the last couple of days. And has triggered some criticism in Seoul that he's trying to influence the upcoming presidential election in South Korea because he was responding directly to a candidate's comments on the importance of strengthening ties between the U.S. and South Korea. So I think we're seeing China's response to that and an awareness that this growing strategic partnership reinforced between Washington and Seoul is one that Washington wants to see expanded across the region.
I think the Chinese ambassador was talking about or referring to the comments made by the young 36-year-old leader of the opposition party.
I think it was the prosecutor general, no? Maybe Gina can clarify.
It was basically the head of the party, because when he was talking about, for example, South Korea's foreign policy going forward, he was, quite forthcoming in his views on the importance of the alliance, for example, and the Chinese basically pushed back, which resulted even more pushback by Koreans on both sides of the aisle. Gina, let me ask you, in the joint statement, mention was made about maintaining stability on the Taiwan Strait and maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. South Korea is not a member of the Quad, but many people said, wow, this is pretty surprising because until now, the Moon government has been very, very cautious on mentioning anything about Taiwan or the Indo-Pacific. So does this signal a change in Korean security orientation towards, for example, greater cooperation with the Americans and other allies?
Well, many people are paying attention to the fact that the comments related to Taiwan was significant, but in my opinion, that comments on Taiwan use the same expression that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs usually comments on Taiwan issues. I would like to emphasize that South Korea intentionally sought to express its principled position on this issue. In particular, after the summit, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs reiterated that it was fully aware of the unique Sino-Taiwan relationship. And he also emphasized that South Korea endorse the peace and stability in Taiwan Strait. He made that statement afterwards. And this attitude to refrain from making specific comments on the Chinese issues, that will possibly continue because the security environment has not changed dramatically. And regarding one of the key issues that China must pay attention to is possibly the missile guideline. The reason why South Korea, used the term missile sovereignty when he declared that the guideline is no longer there, it is because it wanted to send a message that it is not an issue that China should criticize because it's a matter of South Korea's sovereignty. And in the past, the reason why South Korea announced that there is the 800-kilometer range limit was to send a strategic message that South Korea's missiles were not aimed at China. And such a security concern have not disappeared. Back then, in 2017 and 2020, South Korea could continue R&D on missiles. And because of the trade-off between the payload and the range of the missile, actually, South Korea lifted all the actual restrictions on R&D on missile technology. But even at that time, South Korea mentioned that there is a cap on the missile range because of the concerns of China. And this kind of consideration will continue, in my opinion.
Briefly, Brad, I remember seeing some articles after the summit, and these articles were from Japanese analysts who were concerned because precisely the U.S. and the Koreans decided to scrap the bilateral missile accord. So have you heard anything from Japanese analysts on what this means going forward for Korean defense and how that impacts Japanese security planning?
No one who I think we should take seriously has said anything about that, but the usual cranks and whiners are sounding off on that. The Japanese, of course, look at the South Koreans, I think, less as a threat, but in some case an indication of what's possible. And of course, the Japanese have had a debate about strike and offensive capabilities for some time. And so the degree to which the South Koreans are prepared or have the capacity to reach out and touch and see that as a meaningful national security capability, the Japanese are inclined to want a piece of that action too. But I don't think anybody here seriously looks at South Korea and sees it as a threat, not in those terms, and certainly not with those capabilities.
Okay, we have another question from the audience. It's from Michael Chekin. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he says, on cyber disinformation, how does disinformation and cyber trolling undermine elected central governments in Seoul and Tokyo and ROK Japan foreign policy, including historical disputes? Will China and or Russia use cyber disinformation on undermining Seoul and Tokyo governments in their foreign policy? Interestingly, a colleague of mine from Carnegie has done extensive work on the uses of media by Chinese influencers to basically bolster anti-Korean sentiment in Japan. And she's a really respected Japanese professor. And I think that really struck a chord with me because we don't really think about Chinese disinformation campaigns. They focus much more on Russia. But let me ask you, Gene, as the only media expert in this panel, Are you very concerned about the potential for cyber disinformation going forward, as the questionnaire asked the panel?
I think we should always be concerned about cyber disinformation. It's a growing issue globally. I think here in the United States, more than anywhere else, this is an issue that we're battling, because right now, I would say in the United States, we've got different platforms for different people of different political persuasions. But this is happening. The CCP, China, the Communist Party has a very active disinformation arm, and is very actively engaged around the world. It's something to pay attention to. Now, I'm much more concerned about cyber overall rather than just disinformation. And I would say that one of the things that I'm looking at, of course, is North Korea's cyber activities, which I think is something that we underestimate. I am co-hosting a podcast right now for the BBC World Service called The Lazarus Heist that is focused on North Korean cyber, looking at North Korean cyber activities past, and we'll move in the next season into more of the present, but looking at how North Korea has used cyber as a way not only to engage in asymmetric warfare and really disrupt our lives. South Korea has endured these types of attacks for many years. I think the first indication we saw it on a massive scale in the United States was the Sony hack of 2014. And increasingly, I would say North Korea is using cyber to raise money, to help fund its nuclear program, as well as to keep the elites happy. And especially as sanctions are tightened and with the border shutdowns that North Korean officials have imposed, I suspect that they are investing more in cyber as a way to get around those limitations and how to raise money. And that's something that we have to be concerned about. Now, I do think that quite a lot of their activities are about disrupting our lives and showing us, especially those of us in South Korea, a country that is so highly wired and so highly dependent on technology, as I would say the rest of the world is increasingly as well, that they have the potential to disrupt our lives and paralyze our societies. And that's something that we need to be mindful of. And like the provocations with the testing, we will start to see them asserting those capabilities when the timing is right.
Gina, do you think that the Korean government, in particular the defense establishment, takes what Jean just said, North Korean cyber attacks, as a very serious national security threat?
Yes, of course. Well, because like Jim mentioned, North Korea used cyber technology to extort money from the cyberspace. So in South Korea, we're talking about high-tech alliance, including cooperation in cyber security and information communication technology infrastructure. And all this efforts requires concerted efforts to stop North Korea from doing on businesses that are illegal. And it's also a great concern for the South Korean society because there is very blurry line between defense and civilian sector regarding cyber attack. So I'm sure that the South Korean government will be very much concerned about the cyber threat from North Korea. That's why during the summit talk, we decided to have a cyber working group together.
Okay, well, one of the things that really concerns me as I wrote this report is that I agree fully that South Korean companies should play a critical role in fostering more resilient national security supply chains with the U.S., for example, and Korea and other allies. But we also know, Brad, that if you look at the so-called THAAD controversy of several years ago, when after a North Korean nuclear test, then President Park decided to ask the U.S. to deploy the anti-missile system THAAD to protect U.S. forces the Chinese got very upset, and then subsequently they had a discord for over a year that resulted ultimately in the so-called 3-no agreement. But before that agreement came to fruition, Korean companies were blackmailed and basically put on the blacklist by the Chinese government. And so Korean companies had a very difficult time, many of them anyways, doing business as usual in the Chinese market. And given the importance of the Chinese market to Korean companies, do you believe that Korean companies will play a much bigger role in promoting U.S. ROK technology alliance, even though such a step could entail a blowback from the Chinese?
Absolutely. I think because, as you put it, the Chinese are a problem in this space. The fact is that the real future, while the market may be available in China, the fact, if they're going to really, I think, continue to grow and to stay on the cutting edge of technologies, they're going to need to be collaborating with the United States, with the Europeans, with the Japanese. That's the body of potential partners that they have to stay abreast of. And so I think you only choose China for the market, and if you do that to the point where you don't risk getting crosswise with Washington, you'll get crosswise with Berlin, with Brussels, with Paris, with Tokyo, with a bunch of other governments. And if I may, I've always been struck by the way that everyone learned the wrong lessons from the THAAD incident. And that is, I think, very simply, South Korea stood up to China. And yes, you guys got slapped, so we all got a taste, as so many other governments have, of just what it's like to tell the Chinese that we're going to protect our own national interest and not really bow to you. And so we saw how aggrieved the Chinese can be. But at the end of the day, China folded. You guys stood up, and you stood up to the Chinese, and they're the ones that ultimately, I think, had to reverse course. And they're the ones that have been paying a price in terms of public opinion. So I think South Korea learned the wrong lessons, which is they need to be strong. And the Japanese and the Americans learned the wrong lesson, because we've interpreted this just as you explained it, which is, oh, South Korea folded after a period of time, when in fact they did not. And they proved, in fact, their commitment to the alliance and to the principles behind it. And so what we should be doing is figuring out ways to, if you will, continue to stiffen spines, not badmouth our partners for actually making the difficult but right decision. So I think we really need to reassess that THAAD history, look at it through a little less blinkered eyes, and I think we will come to diametrically opposed conclusions on all fronts.
You know, one of the key takeaways from the summit, for me anyways, was the fact that I think in many respects, for the first time, you have a situation whereby the Americans need critical allies, such as South Korea and Japan, but in particular South Korea, that can give the U.S. not only political and diplomatic assistance to the extent that it can, but also provide critical manufacturing technologies and bases for cooperation. So I just asked myself, gosh, if these companies did not exist, Gene, what leverage would we have in a good way with our American partners? And I think if you add climate change, universal values, and all of the other things that the two leaders talked about, and the fact that, for example, South Korea pledged, I think, some $250 million for foreign aid to Central America, which is an area that is critical to U.S. strategic interests. But, you know, most South Koreans really don't pay that much attention to, for example, Central America. And the fact that these two leaders even put that into the summit joint statement, I thought was a major move forward. Your views?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this summit really was a moment for South Korea to show there's something very interesting. So the start of this whole visit, earlier we saw the awarding of this Medal of Honor to this Korean War veteran. And I thought it was such an interesting moment of living history, and a reminder, of course, of the long relationship between the United States and South Korea that's rooted in that conflict. So not only does it remind people that we have this shared history, it also is a reminder that this history is still the present because this conflict hasn't been resolved. But it was important to remind the Americans that this is a long relationship. But also, it was a chance, most importantly, it was a chance for South Korea to step forward and show how far they've come from that country that was so poor. I mean, I recently met a woman who, I often meet people who have family members who served in the Americans who have family members who served in the Korean War. And it means so much to these veterans to see how far South Korea has come. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and as you allude to, there was so much in this joint statement that worked to put South Korea in the position of not just being a country that has grown, but a country that can play a bigger role on the global stage. So putting South Korea on the path of stepping into that role, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to say that I still think that South Korea is in a transition period of going from the mentality of a country that was a developing nation to a country that is a first world nation and a donor nation. So still going through some of the growing pains of making that transition, but well on its way. And that does mean a shift in mentality in terms of how you see yourself and your place in the world. There's still some growing pains that I think this young democracy South Korea is going through, and one of those areas, of course, is grappling with issues such as the gender equality issue. South Korea may have such a strong, vibrant economy, but has the worst record among OECD nations in terms of the gender pay gap. And so there's still areas where they have room to grow. And I can't wait to see South Korea grow into that, because again, I think they will serve as a role model for other countries, not only in Asia, but as you mentioned, across the developing world in places like Central America and Africa, where they could look to South Korea as a role model for how you navigate out of a developing nation status into a country with a more vibrant, resilient, and leading economy. But I still think it has a ways to go. And I think you're absolutely right. When you talk about the significance of South Korean industry, when you look at semiconductors, President Biden himself acknowledged how weak the United States is on semiconductors. And so this is an opportunity for the United States to partner with South Korea, which has been so strong on semiconductors, and for South Korea to show that all of that help that the United States has provided over the years, the support it's provided, has resulted in South Korea, a country that is a leader in this area where they can fill a gap, not only with its partnership with the United States, but globally as well when it comes to that supply chain.
Thank you. Dr. Gil Rosman, formerly of Princeton University, and a person who really follows Northeast Asian Korean affairs very closely, is asking, how do Koreans of different political persuasions respond to U.S. grand strategy for the Indo-Pacific? So Gina, can you answer Professor Gil Rosman's question?
Well, actually, South Korea supports Indo-Pacific strategy as long as it is open, inclusive, and transparent. We stated that South Korean government is ready to work on functional issues such as climate change and COVID-19 response and many others. So, well, in general, I think South Korea is seeking an overlap between U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and South Korea's new Southern policy. So a lot of talks can continue in that regard.
But Brad, when the rubber meets the road, I don't know whether that analogy is correct in the sea, but if, for example, the U.S.-China rivalry intensifies in the U.S.-China Sea, in the South China Sea, for example, or for that matter, in the East China Sea, do you believe that the South Koreans can play a more proactive role in support of U.S. missions in the Indo-Pacific, or is that going too far?
I think it depends on how you define the word support. The South Koreans could certainly do what the Europeans are doing and have their own freedom of navigation operations through the area. I think that's probably a bit aggressive for South Korea. I think you could similarly have the South Koreans assisting the capacity building of littoral states or other countries in Southeast Asia, as the Japanese have done for years. There's certainly nothing stopping South Korea from doing any of these things. And it would be really great to see them do it. It just requires, I think, not only the political will, but the determination to see that through and to perhaps face some of the blowback that is going to that will result from that. And I guess the question becomes for South Korean decision makers: is that the fight that they want to fight? And I'm not suggesting that they, there's nothing that's negative in that. I just think that South Korea has to be smart about the way that it chooses to lean forward, when and where and how. And I think that it's not clear to me that the South China Sea is really one of those places, other than offering the diplomatic support for the arbitral tribunal ruling. I don't think of South Korea, frankly, as just a maritime power in that capacity. And so I just, from my mind, I would say that South Korea, I would prefer and I would be happier to see South Korea working on these economic issues, working on these technology issues, working on these larger diplomacy questions. I would love to see South Korea, for example, join the Blue Dot Network. I think that would be a really interesting statement and lean forward, rather than say necessarily with the freedom of navigation operation. So I guess it's just about being smart and marshaling what are some limited resources in the most efficient way.
Brad, you remind me, this really is a critical point, and thank you so much for bringing it up, because I think regardless of whether Korea joins the Blue Dot Initiative as a counterpunch to, for example, China's, BRI, the fact that you have now the opportunity for Korean companies and state-run enterprises to work and focus on technology cooperation with the U.S. is something that we could not have imagined, 15, 20 years ago.
If I may, two really quick points related to that.
Yeah.
Number one is that the great power competition that we're talking about in the transition to a digital economy, the competitive space, the arena, whatever you want to call it, is going to be technological and diplomatic and economic, perhaps more so than military. And I think that the degree to which there can be a contribution there, that's really where South Korea should try to focus its efforts. Number two, in reference to an earlier comment that you made, I think our vocabulary really matters here. So you talked about the Quad and South Korea joining the Quad. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think what South Korea and any country should do would be to participate in Quad activities, just as participating in the Blue Dot Network. And that, it's a minor difference of shade, but I think it's an important one. And that's how we need to be thinking about what South Korea can do, as an example, precisely as Jean said, to other countries to participate in. And I think that makes a difference, and it is a way in which South Korea can do it and demand attention to the delineation it draws between the form of participation and what precisely it's trying to accomplish.
We have just 7 minutes left, unfortunately. So as we wind down, we have one final question from Mr. Christian Voss, and he asks, how can the ROK balance its ties between the U.S. and China, and even the U.S. and Russia? So Gina, as your final comment, how can the South Koreans, promote this new balance, but still cooperate with the U.S. on critical issues?
Well, as a democratic country, I think South Korea's choice will be, siding with the U.S. In times of competition between the U.S. and China. Because in my opinion, everybody look at that joint statement after the summit and think that South Korea is changing. But it is not true that South Korean government has not been interested in the global agenda pursued by the U.S. We were just not in the right situation to discuss global agenda in details during the Trump era. During the Trump administration, bilateral relations were more important than multilateral ones, and the global agenda was not the main agenda with South Korea. But now we have a different leadership, so we can have more agenda to talk about. And gradually, I think you'll notice that there are more shared interest between the two allies. And South Korea's contribution to the global security cooperation has been there for a very long time. We played a leading role in the discussion of climate change, green economy, renewable energy, all that the Biden administration is interested in. So I think,
But because of time, but the question was, how can South Korea balance between the U.S. and China and even Russia without upsetting all the great powers?
Yes, I think well, South Korea will continue to talk about the principled approach, and in my opinion, we are it'll take time for all of us to see a for example Quad Plus and or something else can become realizable, because Quad is a soft balancing, not a hard balancing. And I think it'll take time for it'll give some time for South Korea to get out of strategic ambiguity.
Okay, Gene, if you look into, let's say, the March presidential election next year, and whatever Kim Jong Un may do with the new Korean president, and that will be dependent upon who gets elected, of course. But do you think that regardless of what happens domestically in South Korea, the room for a broadened and deepened U.S. ROK alliance is going to stay here as a facet of Korean policy, or will it be rocked by either North Korea or domestic politics?
I think it's that relationship is always to the core fairly strong. And I was going to, I wanted to actually refer back to what Dr. Kim was saying, Gina was saying, and point out that South Korea has been navigating great power competition for many, many, many centuries. And so it's not a new position for South Korea or for North Korea. And North Korea approaches it very differently. North Korea chooses to navigate that great power competition by strategically being a gadfly, or strategically using provocation to try to upset the balance and try to gain attention. South Korea has always had to navigate this relationship. China is South Korea's largest trading partner, so we have to remember that. They can't make an absolute choice. But I think what happened after the THAAD incident and the way that South Korean companies felt that they were unofficially sanctioned was a lesson. And so the relationship or the dependence on China is something that South Korean companies have had to check themselves on. But the fact is, it still remains the largest trading partner. When it comes to North Korea, I mean, this is whatever North Korea has done, we've seen it before, and the relationship has endured. These things happen in cycles. Whatever happens with North Korea may be more intense from time to time, but I think the relationship will remain strong regardless of what North Korea throws our way.
Brad, in 30 seconds or less, do you believe that whoever becomes the next Korean president, he will be able to chart a course that will be different from previous Korean administrations? Or do you believe that this is more, I guess, for show rather than in substance?
The possibility exists. I mean, I think that Korea is maturing as a society in many ways, such that it recognizes the complexities of these situations and understands the competing tugs and pulls. The problem, though, as everybody's been acknowledging, is North Korea's determination to remain an issue, and B, just how divided South Korean politics remains. And I guess a lot of it will depend on just how divisive and how ugly the campaign is. I mean, the United States is seeing that as well. And the problem, as you and I have discussed for many years for South Korea, is really the inability to create a consensus on these broader questions of national security and foreign policy that has even to the degree that they traverse administrations, there doesn't seem to be that willingness to acknowledge that continuity. And somehow, even though you want to rebrand, you almost want to reject as a matter of course. And it's unfortunate, because you've even seen progressive presidents do a lot for the alliance, which is not what people anticipate. And so there is the capacity for this continuity and this sort of shift, but it's very much a function, I'm sad to say, of the domestic circumstances that any president faces.
I agree with you in part, but I think we are at an historical inflection point. On the one hand, you have the weight of geopolitics and history and victimization and all of this that basically, sticks South Korea into this geopolitical pod. On the other hand, you have these really existential climate change issues, energy transitions, supply chain resilience, and technology in the fourth industrial revolution. And I think in that sense, South Korea has to ride the correct wave. And I think the correct wave is with our American partners, as well as our global partners, including our Japanese and European friends. But let's see, because the proof will be in March 2022, and we'll see exactly what type of a campaign they run and who we will elect, because that person will be able to put this policy into practice or not. So on that note, let me thank, yes, Brad, yet one final 2 seconds. Yes?
The only thought would be is the degree to which China is prepared to diminish the dilemma and to make it easier for countries to engage on both sides, or whether they're going to force a choice on South Korea like every other country in the region and the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me thank all of you again for giving us your precious time, your great views, your good cheer, and the fact that Gene and Brad came back for a second round. And I am truly grateful to all of you. Let me thank my colleagues, Alex and Katie back at home in Washington. And let me thank Gina, despite the late hour, to give us her views on Korean defense and security. So let's do another round, maybe around October or so. We will be in the thick of the most vicious political campaign in recent Korean memory, and then we'll take a bet as to who's going to be the next person sitting in the Blue House. Thank you very much. Let me thank all of those persons who have been able to field questions and to have watched this on YouTube. And I look forward to engaging with all of you again. And finally, let me also thank the Korea Foundation for sponsoring the Korea Initiative at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.